Today we're going to be making a micro batch of biodiesel, and so I've got all the ingredients behind me here. I'll show you how I do it. It's very similar to a lot of other ways you can find on the internet, but it's this you can actually increase the recipe to whatever size or proportion you want. I'll show you a couple of different ways, but I'm going to make just a very small amount, maybe a pint of biodiesel, just to show you the process. First of all, let's go ahead and get the recipe that I use is this one here. So it calls for 5 grams of sodium hydroxide, 2 milliliters of methanol, and 1 liter of vegetable oil. And then the rest of the recipe is right there. You can pause the camera if you want to look at it a little bit closer. The other way that you can do this is if you just use 20% methanol, 80% oil, and 7 grams of sodium hydroxide per liter of oil. And that's all you really need to make a larger batch if you want to. You can get the ratios and do whatever size of batch you want. But what we're going to do is we're going to use this other one. And the ingredients that you're going to need are vegetable oil. Now, Corona oil works really well, so does peanut oil. If you're doing this to burn in a car and you're looking to save money, you probably don't want to use new oil. You'll want to pick up some oil somewhere else, you know, either used vegetable oil from an old restaurant or whatever. The other thing that you're going to need is you're going to need some sodium hydroxide. Now, sodium hydroxide is nothing more than just basic drain cleaner, lye. This lye that I got here is, I just picked it up at the local hardware store. And sometimes you have to ask for it because they don't usually put it out on the shelves, and then they kind of look at you funny if you want to buy very much of it. But you don't need a whole lot. So that's one thing that you can use. And the other thing you're going to need is you're going to need some methyl alcohol. And the easiest way to get that would be to just use or purchase one of these bottles of heat. You can get these anywhere at any auto parts store. You want to make sure you get the yellow bottle, which is pure methyl alcohol. If you get the red one, it's got some additives in it that kind of mess up the process for biodiesel. These are some of the other methods that I've tried in the past that don't work quite so well. This Drano right here works pretty good, but it also has some some metal flakes in it, so sometimes it kind of gets in the way. This is just regular drain opener, and this is just stuff I bought at Safeway. It works okay, but it doesn't work very well. You can also use isopropyl alcohol instead of the heat, but like I say, this doesn't work very well either, and neither does mineral spirits. That's another one that I've tried in the past. So these are all methods that I've tried, and the one that comes out the best, the one that works best for me anyway, is the heat and the actual lye. So the first thing we need to do is measure out the sodium hydroxide. Sodium hydroxide. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this little mini scale here, and we're going to measure out 5 grams of sodium hydroxide. So let me bring this up to my eyeballs so that I can actually see it. And we're on the gram scale. So let's zero out my scale, and we'll measure out 5 grams. Oops, a little bit more. 5.8, 5.2, 5 grams. It's important that you get the ratios correct on this so that it turns out right. If you're just kind of guessing, and kind of like when you're baking, you just put a pinch of that and a pinch of that in there, sometimes it won't turn out right. So this right here is 5 grams of sodium hydroxide, so I'll move the camera down here so you can get a closer look at it. And so the next step, what we're going to do is we're going to take 220 milliliters methyl alcohol, so the heat additive. So that's the next. Okay, so we're ready to measure out 220 milliliters. Which is right there. So there's 220 milliliters of methyl alcohol. And the next step is what we're going to do is we're going to combine the methyl alcohol with the sodium hydroxide until it's completely dissolved. Now, sometimes you can do this in a glass container, and sometimes you can do it right in your mixing cup, which would be fine. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put it in a glass container so that you can kind of see how it mixes in. And there will be a little bit of heat generated with this when you put it in there, and because that's the agent that that chemical reaction that you're looking for, that's going to separate the oil, and that's what we're looking for with biodiesel. So I'm going to pour my alcohol into my glass container, and then I'm going to add the acid to it, the sodium hydroxide. So make sure I got it all in there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix it up until that is completely mixed. The best idea is to get it to where you don't see any of the sodium hydroxide down there at all, any of the lye. You want to mix it up to where it's all completely dissolved into the alcohol. That will be your best. So while this is mixing, and I'm going to continue stirring this occasionally, we're going to get the oil going, because what we need now is we need 1 liter of vegetable oil, and we need to heat it up to 130 degrees. And we want to get it as close to 130 degrees as possible. So that's all right. I have half a liter added to my can. Here's the other half of the liter I'm pouring in the can. And I'm going to put it on my hot plate now and start it warming up. So remember, we're going to heat this to 130 degrees Fahrenheit. And it needs to be pretty close to that, as close as we possibly can get it. In the meantime, what I'm doing is I'm mixing up making sure that my sodium hydroxide and my alcohol is mixed up. And if you can see that, it's pretty much mixed up. There's a couple of little flakes on the bottom, but other than that, it's pretty well mixed. And if you feel the glass, it's nice and warm, which means that that's good. I've got a good chemical reaction going already in here. And so now, as soon as our oil heats up, we should be ready to mix the sodium hydroxide and alcohol mixture with the oil. And what that's going to do is that's going to separate the glycerins out of the oil. So the whole purpose behind biodiesel is to separate the glycerins, or the fatty acids, out of the vegetable oil or animal fat or whatever it is that you're using. And it helps the biodiesel to not coagulate quite as easily. And so it keeps it a little bit fluid. Now, it will coagulate a lot easier than petrol diesel. And so that's why a lot of times when you see people using biodiesel, they mix it with petrol diesel. And there's some other ways that we can talk about as far as how to use biodiesel and not get it to coagulate inside your fuel lines and inside your injectors, because that could be a big problem. Some people, they'll take and use 2 fuel tanks, so they'll have a biodiesel tank and they'll have a petrol diesel tank. They'll start their vehicle up using petrol, then they use a switching valve to switch over to your biodiesel, and that's what they drive around on. And then before they finish, or before they shut the car off, they switch back over to petrol diesel and run it long enough to get petrol diesel in your fuel lines and in through your injectors. And that way you don't have the biodiesel going solid inside your fuel lines when it gets cold. Another method is to use like a fish tank heater or some type of heater. Sometimes they run a heat exchanger through the fuel tank or something like that to warm up the biodiesel to get it nice and warm and keep it in a fluid state. Because that's really critical. You don't want your diesel to gel up on you. Okay, we're going to check the temperature of our oil. And as you can see, I got it just a little bit too hot. It's easy to do that. It's easy to get your oil a little too hot. If you get it too hot, sometimes it doesn't separate the way it should. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it off. I'm going to take my oil can off from the hot plate and put it on this nice cold metal table and see if I can cool it down a little bit. Okay, we've waited until it's cooled enough. So now it's 130 degrees. And so the next step we're going to do is we're going to add the alcohol and lye mixture into the biodiesel. And what this does is this is actually going to create the chemical process that we need to separate the glycerins. And so I'm just going to put a lid on it. Now you do have to burp it every once in a while because it will build up a little bit of pressure in there. And then I'm just going to shake it around and mix it up. You should be mixing this for about 20 minutes if you're wanting to do a really good mixture on this. And when you mix it up, it should turn nice and cloudy like this. So this actually, let me get it back in frame here. This looks pretty good. So this looks like it's going to be a good mixture. So I'm going to go ahead and mix this for another 20 minutes and then we'll come back and we'll take a look and see what's happening. So as I'm mixing this, you can see it's turning a darker color. It's that darker yellow color. That's actually a good sign. What that is it's the glycerins that are starting to separate out of the oil. The glycerins are usually dark and they'll sink to the bottom, leaving your biodiesel on the surface of your jar. And so I'm going to continue mixing this and then we'll let it set. And then once you let it set, what will happen is the biodiesel will start to separate from the glycerins. And then there's only a couple more steps and would be finished. So you can see that it looks pretty good. That's nice dark color, that caramel color. It's looking really good. So this looks like it's going to be a good batch. Okay, I've been mixing it for about 20 minutes and now it's time to let it set. Notice the nice dark color we've got. That's good. The jar is rather warm, and that's because of the 130 degrees we heated the oil to, plus the chemical reaction that's taking place with the drain cleaner and the alcohol. And every once in a while with this jar, I've got to burp it a little bit because it does build up a little bit of pressure in here, and I don't want it to, you know, start leaking out of the lid. So I just crack it open a little bit every once in a while just to let the pressure off. And what we're going to do is we're going to let it separate, and we'll see if it starts to separate out into biodiesel. So we'll come back in a little bit and take a look. Okay, my jar has been sitting here for about a half hour now, and we've got a really good separation going. Let me get the camera down here so that you can see it a little bit better. But you can see that separation right down there. That's the glycerins that were in the oil that we've chemically altered, and now the glycerins have separated from the oil. And what's left on top here is your biodiesel. So this right here is your biodiesel. And so what you would do is you would pour this stuff off, and then the next step is to wash it and dry it. So it sounds kind of funny, but you need to rinse it with some good clean distilled water, and then what that does, it pulls the soap and everything that's in the biodiesel out and makes it a little more clean, a little more pure in the process. But this right now is chemically altered, so it is no longer the same oil that we started with. And that's what the glycerins are. Now the glycerins down here, That's your waste product, so that can just be thrown away. It's non-hazardous, to my knowledge. It doesn't have any thing to worry about as far as throwing it away. I would not pour it down a drain simply because it will get solid if it gets cold, and it could plug up your drain. But it's not going to hurt anything if you put it out in the environment, because it's just the fatty acids out of the oil. So anyway, the next process would be to wash the biodiesel, but I'm going to let it sit for a period of about 24 hours before I do that. And so we'll be back when it's time to wash the diesel. Okay, it's now the next day, and what I've done is I've separated the glycerins from the biodiesel. So if you look at this, there's still a little bit of glycerins down there in the bottom. If I can tilt it this way so you can kind of see them, see how those little dark spots on the bottom there, this stuff right down here. So there still is a little bit of glycerin in there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do the first washing stage. So what I've got is I've got some pure distilled water in my jar, and it's a little bit warm. Just warm water out of the tap is fine. You don't have to heat it up or anything. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour this in with the water, and then I'm just going to shake it around. And what that'll do is it'll pull the soap that's left in the biodiesel out. So I like these jars that have a little bit of a shoulder on them because it's easier to pour them out. You can kind of see up at the top of the screen there, the glycerins can be trapped there, so I'm not pouring the glycerins into the jar. So we'll set that off to the side, and then I'll get my lid on here, and what you want to do is you want to just shake this around, and what the solution is going to turn rather white, as you can see. It's going to turn almost like a milkshake color. And then it will start separating out. The water will separate down here to the bottom, and the rest of it will come to the top. The biodiesel will come back up to the top. And what you want to do on this is this one, you want to let it set overnight with the lid off. And my experience, I've found that sometimes it takes several days for this to separate out and for all the water to separate out of it. But bottom line is, once it all separates out and this is fairly clear again, what you're going to do is you're going to pour this off, dispose of the water, and then do the same thing again. And each time leaving it open to the atmosphere, and that's the drying process. And so it usually takes about 2 or 3 washes before you get good, clear, clean biodiesel. And for the sake of time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a sample that has been washed and thoroughly dried. I think I washed it 4 times, and it turned out really well. It's a good sample of biodiesel. So I will show you that sample now. So here is a sample of biodiesel that has been washed 4 times and thoroughly dried, and it's good to go. So you can see the difference between this and the original Corona oil. This right here is the original Corona oil, and you can see it looks a little bit thicker, and the coloring is just a slight different, not a whole lot. This, the biodiesel, which is this stuff here, tends to be a little bit darker, and it's a lot more runny because we've separated out the fatty acids and the glycerins, whereas this is the original oil, the original canola oil that we used. And so that's the process of making biodiesel, and like I said, you can make it in as large of quantities as you want to. This is just showing you the process of how to do it. And so like I say, in order to finish this batch, all we would need to do is wash it 3 more times, or maybe 2 more times. The white stuff that's separating down here at the bottom, that's your soap. When you start seeing very little of that, then you know you're done washing. And then it's just a matter of letting it set open to the atmosphere, And as soon as it separates out and turns clear like this, you're good to go. And like I say, this stuff here, it usually takes, in my experience, about 3 or 4 days of setting out before it really separates out to where it's completely clear like this. So anyway, that wraps it up. That's how you make biodiesel. We'll see you in the next video.